This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As journalists, we cringe at studies like the one released this week by Northwestern University's Medill School. It found that by 2025, 1/3 of American newspapers that existed roughly 2 decades ago will be out of business. On average, more than 2 newspapers disappear each week. Today, there are fewer than 6,500 newspapers, both dailies and weeklies, left in the U.S., and digital news replacements aren't filling the gap. These growing news deserts in our country are also dangerous for democracy. Coming up Where We Live, we hear from journalist and former Current reporter Daniela Altimari. The Current and other Tribune newspapers are owned by hedge fund Alden Capital, which has contributed to the news desert crisis with its aggressive cost-cutting measures and elimination of news jobs in several areas of the country. We want to hear from you. What news do you consume? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Share a comment on our Facebook page. Or find us on Twitter, @WhereWeLive. My first guest on Zoom is Penelope Muse Abernathy, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Penny, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, the Washington Post, Margaret Sullivan wrote this week that you, quote, may be the nation's foremost expert on what media researchers call news deserts. So walk us through some key takeaways, Penny.
Well, first, let me say Margaret Sullivan is incredibly gracious, and I really appreciate the comment. But she also has done quite a bit of research on what is going on local news. Let me put this in perspective. We talk a lot about two Americas. Mm-hmm. We split politically, culturally, and economically. There's also a split digitally, which I can talk about a little bit later. But what is most concerning to me about this latest report, I've done 5 reports over the past 7 years, is that there appears to be a growing disparity between communities that have local news, have access to local news, have the resources to support local news, and communities in the U.S. And we are a vast country, but communities in the U.S. that do not have a local news. You can almost hear the sucking sound going out of the news ecosystem as we lose reporters as well as newspapers and don't have, as you pointed out earlier, enough digital outlets to fill the void.
When we talk about news deserts, so what have you found in terms of where in our country people are most impacted? And how many are we talking about?
Well, I think it might be helpful to first talk about what is a news desert, and that is a place we've defined as where residents have very limited access to the sort of news and information they need to make wise everyday decisions as well as long-term decisions that affect the lives of future generations. So we have found that roughly on this latest report, roughly 1/5 of the population, or 70 million people, live in either a news desert or at one that is at risk of becoming a news desert. Most likely, the news desert is affecting communities that are economically struggling. Many of those communities are much poorer than the U.S. The household income is much less, and the poverty rate is much higher than the U.S. And it also encompasses traditionally underserved communities, especially minority communities in this country.
When we think about how we got here, when we look at company consolidation, that's a major factor, Penny?
It is. In fact, that's the way I began tracking the number of news outlets here. Post the 2008 recession, we had a new type of owner enter the market here in the U.S. I call them investment entities. It includes hedge funds. It includes private equity groups. And they were very different from traditional newspaper owners, many of whom had started as small family operations that grew to be publicly traded chains. They had names of the family founder or the name of the flagship in the title of what their company was. These have different sort of names like Alden Capital, like Gatehouse. It's not something that says you can reach out and touch the journalist on the other end of the phone. And what we found is those largest chains, they become kind of mega chains now, have been the most aggressive in both shuttering newspapers and laying off journalists over the past 2 decades or decade.
You're talking with us here in Connecticut. So how does Connecticut compare when we think about news deserts, Penny?
Well, actually, New England fares quite well compared to places in the South. I worry most about places in the South, which tends to have some of the poorest states in the country, as well as in the Midwest. Connecticut is on the East Coast. It's much more compact and doesn't have these, Texas, for instance, has, if I'm trying to remember, something like 254 counties, whereas Connecticut, you can count them almost on two hands, the number of counties that you have. In the Midwest, you may have very few counties, but sometimes those counties encompass tens of thousands of square miles. So in general terms, if you compare it to other states, Connecticut comes out quite well. That doesn't mean there aren't gaps in the flow of local news in Connecticut or in New England as a whole. So, I mean, I think that one of the hopes I've had for the research I do is that we can see where things are working and what is working in reaching communities, and also identify where the gaps are. So we need to target funding toward that.
You're hearing Penelope Muse Abernathy, visiting professor at Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism, as we talk about local news and the fact that so many newspapers have shuttered and the consequences of that in terms of making sure that citizens are informed about what's happening around them. We'd love to hear from you, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Penny, I asked you about Connecticut. There's this great resource from you and your team. We just tweeted out at Where We Live, usnewsdeserts.com, where people can look at the state of Connecticut and see, depending on what county or what region, the amount of newspapers or lack thereof that exist. And I believe Tallinn County does not have one local newspaper that exists.
Right. And I was just on confirming again, there's none listed that we could find. It might be covered by an adjacent, but it doesn't look like it. And Tallinn is quite similar to what we find in many states. It's kind of a border county. It shares a border with another state, and they're often called orphan counties. In many places, orphan counties, because they often get the TV signal from regional television in other states, so that puts them at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to voting in elections and the like. I happen to live in a border county in North Carolina, and I get the three signals from the South Carolina TV stations, which makes it very difficult to even understand what's going on in the state legislature. Increasingly, as we lose newspapers, however, we're beginning to see orphan counties that don't have a newspaper in that county. In fact, the only newspaper that really serves that area may be a newspaper in the next state. So, I mean, we need to think about the news ecosystem is somewhat complex, but it's also very simple. And I start with this observation: we are a huge country, and for the past 200 years, we have really depended on newspapers and to be the prime, if not the sole source of the local news and information that we need every day. Someone who covers the school board, someone who covers the county commissioner. And when we lose a newspaper, we lose that journalist that informs us about the decisions that are being made that really will impact our everyday lives. So it is and because we do not have the digital substitutes, it becomes a real issue as to how we get people informed and how they can then make wise decisions.
And what happened during the first 2 years of this pandemic? We know there were many headlines about the acceleration or the demise of local news with hundreds of print outlets that shuttered. What did your research find?
Well, I mean, I think the good news is there were quite a number of people that wrung their hands and said, oh, this is going to be an extinction level event for newspapers. We didn't have the extinction level event. And I think part of that may have been because of the payroll protection plan, which gave loans that were forgiven to small businesses that kept their doors open. But we did continue to lose at the same rate we've been losing at. So you mentioned at the beginning, we've been losing an average of 2 papers a week over the last since 2005. And to put that kind of in perspective, you can lose a newspaper two ways. You can also lose a digital site two ways. One is you just announce you haven't got the money to meet payroll and you're going to stop publishing. Another is it gets bought by one of the large chains. The large chain then merges it with another weekly or newspaper, and then that weekly gets merged with the daily, and soon is kind of a vanishing act. Soon you look around, there's no longer a building where the newspaper was published. The one or two reporters and journalists that covered that area have been reassigned to the home paper or base, and you're left without any kind of coverage in that community.
Again, you can join us 888-720-9677 as we talk about the state of local news and how news deserts or places with limited access to news have grown in the U.S. Now, we think about how users consume news, and obviously the digital platform is huge, but it's not necessarily the case that digital news is filling these gaps when we talk about the loss of local news coverage. To learn more, with us now on Zoom is Nick Newman, Senior Research Associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism, one of the lead authors of the annual Reuters Digital News Report. Nick, welcome to our show.
Thanks very much. Very good to be with you.
So tell us about the declines in news consumption that you observed in this year's report, specifically when we talk about the U.S.
We've been running surveys of news consumption and attitudes for more than 10 years. So, I think just thinking about those 10 years, we've just seen extraordinary changes and broadly pretty much in every country, including the US. We see these decline in traditional sources in terms of consumption. So, Penny was talking about the supply side, but in terms of consumption, obviously far fewer people consuming print, feeling print is relevant to their lives, and fewer people now consuming television and linear radio too. And online during that period is not making up the gap. It stayed pretty much flat. And I think that's partly because people who use online news regularly anyway tend to be richer and better educated. So we've been talking about divides already. So online sort of pushes you towards people who are super informed. And then what we also find in this year's report is growing numbers of people who are just disconnecting from news. So in the US, 15% say that they don't consume any of those sources of news, print, television, online, including social media or radio. And then we also find a very large group of people who do consume the news every week, but also say they selectively avoid the news sometimes or often. So this idea of news fatigue or news avoidance is also growing. So partly it's a problem on the supply side, and partly it's a problem on the demand side.
When we think about the people who are avoiding news, is it because of, the tone of the news or what's happening in the world that they can't stomach? Or does it have to do with when we think about the political spectrum and how people feel in terms of how stories are covered?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things. In the US, of the people who say they avoid the news, which is 42% or so, half of those say the news has a negative effect on their mood. And that's particularly the case for women and for younger people as well. So under 35s talk a lot about, news creating anxiety. This idea that news is actually bad for your health. News is supposed to be good for democracy and informing you so you can make sensible decisions. But then you also have that, particularly in the US, you have that idea of the news being biased in this incredibly polarized society. So 39% of people who say they avoid the news say because they can't, it's untrustworthy or biased. So effectively people, you can't trust what you see or what you read. And the US is just, much more polarized in that sense than other parts of the world that we look at. Other people talk about, leading to arguments, which relates to the previous point, or just feeling powerless, in the face of these enormous global stories, pandemics, climate change, Ukraine, particularly the sort of national level. People really feel that, they feel powerless, that they have no sense of agency.
And before we get to the role of social media and the usage in the U.S., when we think about what you mentioned about people who are wealthier who tend to seek out news online, what's the percentage in the U.S. of people who are paying for online content, and are they more likely to be paying for multiple news sites?
Well, that's the other side of it. Is how the employment of journalists depends on sustainable business models, and with the fall of print revenues and print circulations, more of that burden has fallen on digital, and in digital, it's really hard to make money. First, people tried through advertising, and now increasingly they're trying through subscriptions or membership at a local level, perhaps, or donations, which is something that's growing. But it's really tough. I mean, in the US, the vast majority of people aren't prepared to pay or contribute to any news organization. So only 19% pay. That's slightly above the average across the countries that we look at, but still pretty low. I mean, we are starting to see on the positive side, you've heard about, the New York Times and the Washington Post and that huge growth of subscriptions that we saw just after Donald Trump was elected. But what you have now is, people are starting to take out sort of 2 or 3 subscriptions, partly because there's sort of cheaper options available. So you might pay for the New York Times and a local newspaper, or at least donate something. Or maybe, an individual journalist writing a Substack newsletter. This is sort of something that's grown over the last few years. I think there's 1 million subscriptions now where people are paying for newsletters in the US. So we're starting to see some interesting new ways in which we might deliver local news or specialty news.
When you mentioned paying for news in different ways, I was thinking about Substack and how that may appeal to younger Americans versus getting the daily email in your inbox, and which demographic that appeals to, Nick.
I think email and Substack doesn't really appeal to young people generally. Email in our research is very much for older people, and young people are spending most of their time in social platforms, and they also expect news to be free. They expect it to be frictionless, and a lot of the way in which the news is produced and the way it's delivered over the internet just doesn't meet that target.
So when we talk about social media, Facebook still king where people are getting their news?
Yes, it is. It is still huge, and particularly in the US, actually, it remains very important. But I think what we're seeing, particularly with younger groups, what we call social natives, so people who've grown up with social media, is embracing very different, more visual mobile networks. So Instagram over the last couple of years has grown enormously, but also just in the last 2 years, really TikTok. And TikTok was originally just somewhere for a bit of fun and entertainment. But over the last year, we've seen with Ukraine, with the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp trial, for example, really news is coming onto that platform, and it's not just traditional media companies. In fact, hardly at all. It's a lot of the news that's conveyed is through influencers and social media personalities. So, the news is now being mediated in different ways for young people as well, and that's another challenge for media organizations, because there's virtually no business model there for them, and they need people to come to their websites or apps, and that's not how young people want to consume news.
Again, that's Nick Newman, Senior Research Associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Penny, I'd love to hear you respond to what Nick has shared here.
Well, I think first off, let me make a point about what we've seen when we've analyzed what the news that traffics on the internet or on social media. And, more than 90% of it is national. We're very polarized, as Nick mentioned, in the U.S. politically. And that just kind of adds to, I think, a sense of fatigue. If you get local news on digitally, invariably it's a Facebook group or some other kind of citizens group where it comes with a lot of opinion. And so I think that a lot of the fatigue that we see right now gets back to the notion there's just a total loss of and lack of local news. Whether you're trying to find out whether the pandemic is affecting your community, whether you're trying to find out something as simple as who's running for local office. So I think that part of it's also interesting to me, as there have been quite a number of surveys done in the U.S., the level of trust in news media has gone down steadily and somewhat alarmingly, especially for national organizations. But while it's decreasing for local, it's still as much higher. So I think part of the solution here is figuring out how you get the content back in, the news content back into the ecosystem, and secondly, how you deliver it so people can actually consume it in a way that makes the news that they're reading relevant to their everyday lives.
And you're listening to Where We Live as we talk about state of local news. I want to thank Nick Newman again for joining us. We're going to link out to the annual Reuters digital news report. He was one of the lead authors on our website, ctpublic.org/where we live. Nick Newman, thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much.
And staying with us is Penny Abernathy, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Penny and her team track local journalism trends, highlighting what's at stake for our democracy and the possibility also of reviving the local news landscape. Coming up, we're going to hear from Hearst, Connecticut Media Group, which has expanded in our state, including the digital statewide news site CT Insider. Hearst's Senior Vice President of Content and the Editor-in-Chief joins us after the break. You can join us, too. What news do you consume? 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The news landscape has changed dramatically in our country from a time when most households received a local newspaper. Today, newspapers are vanishing, an average of more than 2 a week, according to a new study by Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. The study's lead author is my guest today, Penny Abernathy, visiting professor at Northwestern. She says we should be concerned that news deserts are expanding, impacting 70 million Americans. Now, earlier, Abernathy shared that Connecticut's news landscape isn't as dire as other regions of the country, but there is one county, Tolland, that doesn't have any local newspapers. Now, listeners are also familiar with the reduced number of reporters at the Hartford Courant. 2 decades ago, there were nearly 400 news staff. That number comes from former Courant reporter Mark Pasniokis, now at the Connecticut Mirror. The Courant and other Tribune newspapers are now owned by hedge fund Alden Capital. We reached out to the Hartford Courant, and its executive editor, Helen Bennett, tells us they've hired at least a dozen full-time newsroom employees since March, including 1 photojournalist and 1 Hartford City reporter. Those positions had been unfilled. Now, Hearst Connecticut Media Group has made huge investments expanding news coverage in the state. Joining us now on Zoom is Wendy Metcalfe, Senior Vice President of Content and Editor-in-Chief of Hearst Connecticut Media Group. Wendy, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I mentioned these huge investments, so tell us about them.
We're really excited at Hearst, Connecticut, because we do have a positive news story. We've made a lot of investment, as you say, and part of that has been further investment in our local news, but also statewide. So with the creation of CT Insider last year, we are trying to better serve communities across Connecticut with quality news. We talked a lot about trust today, news that you can trust. And then using the tools available to make sure that the reader experience is the best it can be. So a lot of different things go into making that work. Everything from the product experience for different platforms, from newsletters to digital to print to the magazine that we publish, to making sure that we're investing in the tools, the training, the culture of our team, that we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to make sure both our content is strong, but that also in our hiring practices and our newsroom, that we are living up and we are accountable to the aspirations we have in that space. With all of those things, Lucy, we have found that it is the recipe for success in this space. And I'm pleased to say that we're on a journey to achieve 100,000 paid digital and print subscriptions And we have just recently passed 40,000 digital subscriptions across Hearst, Connecticut's network.
So when we talk about Hearst, that's 8 daily newspapers. You got a community of weeklies, and then I mentioned CT Insider. So tell us, you mentioned the importance of increasing the digital subscriptions. So tell us your strategy and how are you getting people to subscribe?
So Penny mentioned something about relatable content. And one thing that we find is that residents are really interested in local news, but also statewide, as long as they can relate to the content. So we saw an opportunity to sort of spread our wings. And by doing so, not only do we cover, the school board in a locality, we also do investigations and we do data reporting and really enterprise type work to better serve society. So when you talk about news deserts or what have you, it is vital for journalists to be there as a watchdog for communities, not just to unearth important information, but to lead a conversation that can drive change. To give you an example, we recently did a months-long investigation into domestic violence. In doing so, it created a conversation, and now there is a pledge in Connecticut to invest around $18 million to close some of those gaps. Furthermore, I heard a story from the reporter who was leading the investigation that a woman walked into a domestic violence shelter and cited the Connecticut Post, having read the investigation there. And if we can just help one person, then we have done our job. But I think that investigations like that and the frequency of them increasing is an absolute vital public service and a key role that newspapers, both locally and across the United States, play.
When we think about this digital first model, that's important when we think about how you're getting information out and maybe what you are highlighting versus the traditional, we think about having a handheld newspaper in front of you.
Yeah, we have to be where people are. You've heard that saying before. We believe deeply in the print product, and there are certain readers that absolutely want to stay with it. And we are finding strong retention rates, although there is a decline with print and a preference towards digital. When we speak about digital, we have to remember that it's not just the story that counts. People want a robust experience. They want different product offerings. For newsletters, for example, online, they want a complete one-stop shop to read everything that's going on in their locality. There's also a mix of free and paid content. So we try to make sure that we are innovative in that space. At the same time, what is absolutely crucial is the investment that our company is making to allow us to innovate, to look at different tools that are available to us. But at the center of all of it is the reader, both in terms of our journalism and the experience. If you get all of those things right, and you also have strong departments like our advertising department, the consumer revenue department, customer service, if they are firing on all cylinders, then there is growth in this industry. And if that investment does work, then we're already talking about future investment. So it can pave the way for success down the road as well.
And when you talk about investment, that means making decisions that, may call attention or think about the jobs that are lost. I'm wondering if you can talk about the decision to close the printing presses, I believe, and that affected about 28 jobs. Tell us about that decision.
Yeah, and I think that the move to Albany's presses, it's a more modernized press, and we do think that it's going to serve the reader well who desires the print product. Obviously, no one wants to put jobs at risk, but I can tell you that everybody was basically offered or we discussed different roles that are available either in a distribution in Connecticut or opportunities in Houston and Albany. So that's something we take very seriously. That said, our goal is to try to add as much longevity to print as possible. And this move is something that the company saw necessary to do so.
You're hearing Wendy Metcalfe here on Where We Live, Senior Vice President of Content and Editor-in-Chief of Hearst Connecticut Media Group, as we talk about the investments the company has made to hire more journalists to cover more of the state. You can join us. Where do you go for your news? 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Wendy, you mentioned statewide. Is it really statewide? Because we're hearing from Penny, Tolland County, we've got a news desert there.
Yeah. So the way we balance the statewide reporting is that we're very focused on everything from topics like political out of the Capitol, enterprise. I cited the investigation there. We also just launched another follow-up to our Policing the Police investigation, where we look deeply into misconduct. But it can also be things like, what are the top 20 things to do in Connecticut this weekend? So we try to have a broad spectrum of content as well. So when we talk about, the COVID content and people maybe needing a break from some of the hard news, we really do focus on having, a large cross-section of content, and also content that different audiences may be interested in. The other thing I would say is that we are now building close to 170 editorial staff members across our newsrooms. That is incredibly robust. We also have the Hearst newspapers outlet to lean on across markets: San Francisco Chronicle, Houston Chronicle. We have centralized development hubs that deepen our work through interactive maps. I would challenge you to look at our website and see how different it is to the New York Times. They're incredible at what they're building for the reader. So I think, that gives us a lot of opportunity, but it doesn't come easy. We have to prove that the model is working. And the great thing is, with the digital success that we've seen, I'll cite one really incredible headline. Since the launch of our digital subscription business at the end of 2019, we have grown it every single month, almost 3 years in a row of digital growth. That shows that this model is working, and it's because of that key collaboration and deep commitment to quality local and statewide journalism. And this is just the start. We're just getting started in some respects when it comes to the statewide content. So you will have seen recently, we also deepened our coverage in Greater Hartford. We just recently added 2 more sports reporting roles so that our Game Time website, which is a local sports reporting network, it's an incredible space, more than 32,000 Insta followers, everything you can imagine. We're about to launch Athlete of the Week. So all of those things are just sort of complementing and supplementing each other. And they really are working. And I'm just so delighted to share a story. It doesn't mean that it's easy for the industry. We are not immune to the headwinds that we're seeing, but it's about being agile and entrepreneurial and just trying to pivot and keep up with the changes in technology and always serve your reader well.
Penny Abernathy still with us, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Penny, what do you think of Hearst, Connecticut's model and what you're hearing?
Well, I think it goes back to what we talked about in the latest report. Ownership can make a huge difference, regardless of where you're located. I love listening to what Wendy talked about, and it reinforces what has been found in terms of the research that's been done over the past half century, more or less. I want to start by pointing out one of the things we found in the report is that we've lost more than 60% of the newspaper reporters in the last just 15 years. And most of that loss has been, as Wendy points out, at the statewide level. And when you lose the statewide, the reporters on the state and metro papers, what you're losing are those reporters that did the great analytical and contextual reporting on beats like education, environment, and the like. And you're also losing the investigative reporting that Hearst is doing so well. And I want to get back to my 2 favorite definitions of a newspaper. And I want to stress that I think a newspaper, when I argue for a newspaper, I'm not arguing for the print version. I like what Wendy said about meeting readers wherever they are. I'm arguing for the mission and purpose that a newspaper formed in kind of pulling together this country around its democratic principles, as well as creating social cohesion. So my favorite definitions of a good, strong local news organization are: 1, that it's a problem solver. Relating back to what Wendy said. And 2, it shows you how you're related to people you may not know you're related to. in the county where you live or in a different part of the state.
I wanted to plug Connecticut Public's investigative unit, the Accountability Project, as well as the company here for full transparency has been expanding and growing our news operation. That gets me to the question for you, Penny. You and your team are looking at newspapers and the decline in recent decades, but have you studied public media, or what about ethnic media and how they are filling the gaps?
Yes, we have not addressed it in this report. I did look at it in the 2020 report, and I love coming on NPR because NPR has done a wonderful job of trying to both pull together important local stories, but also bind a region and the state together. NPR, if I'm remembering correctly, has added more than 1,000 reporters over the last decade. And so I think that we need to look at all of the various mechanisms of where people go for their news. And then we have also looked at ethnic media. Ethnic media is somewhat more difficult to track because we don't have many of the ethnic news outlets belonging to major organizations that we can quickly get a census on. But that's on our radar to do next as soon as we turn from this.
Mm. And when we think about commercial broadcast outlets and your take there, Penny, what are you seeing?
Well, not based on my research, but research that others have done. Many, when you lose a newspaper, when you lose it, don't have a digital or print substitute, which is often the case when you lose a newspaper, people turn to regional television for news. The problem there is, I mentioned the problem of orphan counties, but more importantly, content analysis of the news that's on television has shown that more than 90% of it is focused on what happened in the metro area where that newspaper is located. So you're likely to get a TV reporter if you have a major weather or disaster in your neighborhood, or maybe some kind of fun feature story occasionally, but you're not going to get the kind of coverage that Wendy was talking about that CT Insider provides, as well as the local papers. So they're providing both the local angle as well as what it means for you from as a member of the state and a region.
In general, how viable are for-profit models, Penny, when we think about philanthropy and government intervention?
Well, I don't want the whole story to be depressing. I mean, what we see are examples of entrepreneurial ownership and innovation, overcoming the issues that a publisher might experience in a community. So, I can point to numerous examples where companies just like Hearst have made a commitment. Listen to what people really need and want, and try to innovate and experiment and move forward going with that. So I think the most I get back again is that, there are three things that are going to determine how likely it is that the odds are in your favor. One is that, what are the demographics of the community? Is it expanding or is it affluent? Two, who is the owner, and can he meet the needs and expectations of the community? And three, is there available capital to do exactly what Wendy was talking about, which is to invest in both the content as well as the product experience? Are you giving it to people where it is? So, the unfortunate problem we have right now is, while philanthropy has stepped up and done that made some major investments over the last several years in news, which is a break with the past. Most of the large philanthropic organizations that have large endowments are located in exactly the metro areas and cities where there are also potential for-profit models. So we need to really think how we get what's working in the cities are working in those affluent areas out and covered either with a for-profit, nonprofit, or maybe even some public money to cover those.
You're hearing Penny Abernathy here on Where We Live, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. She'll stay with us, but I want to thank Wendy Metcalfe from Hearst, Connecticut Media Group, Senior Vice President of Content and Editor-in-Chief. Wendy, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much.
We're going to continue talking after the break about local news. What news sites do you rely on in your community? Tom in Manchester called in to say he subscribes to The Current and The Inquirer. Thank you, Tom. You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today we've been talking about newspapers and their decline in the U.S. in recent decades, leading to news deserts where millions of Americans are cut off from the news happening in their communities. As we've heard from my guest, Penny Abernathy, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, this has far-reaching consequences. Joining us now on Zoom is Daniela Altimari, a longtime Connecticut journalist. She's now a reporter for Route 50, a national digital outlet covering state and local government across the U.S. Daniela, welcome back to the show.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. So when I say long time, you were at the Hartford Courant for about 25 years, and you left in March. Can you observe what you saw happening there, especially with this new ownership of hedge fund Alden Capital?
Sure. I just want to quickly, though, make one point. There was some discussion earlier about Tolland County being a news desert. I'm not quite sure that's true, as referenced by your caller, who's in Manchester, said they subscribe to the JI. JI covers Tolland, I think, very well. As it so happens, probably the lead story, or maybe the off-lead story in the Current today on the Connecticut page, is a story about a new town manager in Tolland. So I'm just not sure that Tolland is an example of a news desert. I think the community of Tolland and the county, the small towns and the larger communities like Vernon within Tolland County are still getting good coverage from both the JI and the Current. But back to your point, what you brought me on for, yes, a lot of changes at the Current over my 25 years. Most of it not so good, but sometimes we old timers tend to put our rosy glasses on and say things were so great when we had 300 people in the newsroom. There were still mistakes made. There were still stories that being done that perhaps didn't always serve the readers. So I don't want to gloss over that. And looking at things today, yes, Alden Global Capital is not a force for good. They are really just awful people. Committed to wringing every last dollar out of the newspapers they own. However, the staff that's at the Current now is just doing a tremendous job, I think, under very difficult circumstances. They don't have a newsroom. There's a lot of challenges, but these folks are out there every day. The Current, I still subscribe. It's still doing an amazing job covering the state. You have reporters like Chris Keating, who are incredibly experienced. You have energetic newcomers. You have energetic old timers like Ken Goslin, who are just doing an amazing job. And I just feel badly that the ownership of the chain is not on board with really taking the journalism that they're doing and rewarding them for it and highlighting it to the degree it deserves.
We heard from a listener earlier, Daniela, who described growing up in a household where they got the morning paper and the afternoon paper. She also remembers helping her brother with his paper route. And pretty much everyone on the street got their paper delivered. Kathy goes on to say it awkwardly made the transition to online newspapers and the multiple nonprofit news entities here. It's funny she says awkwardly because, there is this sense of the traditional way of getting the news and having to make that switch. It still probably feels strange for some.
Yeah, but, let's look at the advantages, too. I mean, back in the day, in the 90s, when I started at the Current in the late 90s, reporters were very removed from their communities. I mean, yeah, sure, someone could call me up, or write a letter or visit the office. But for the most part, we didn't have the kind of interactions we do today on social media and just, readers, they see our email address in the paper, and they can reach out to us. And, that's a really good thing. That's a really positive thing. So again, I don't want to imply that things were always better in the old times. In fact, when I started at the Current, the paper was owned by Times Mirror. We already were not, the Current was already not locally owned at that point. And people would complain about Times Mirror and how they weren't investing in the paper and how they didn't care about the communities that the Current covered. So, what we're seeing now is sort of the extreme version of that. And it just has gotten so much worse. But again, there are advantages to sort of the digital era, which is, of course, different from what's going on with the ownership.
Thank you, Daniela Altimari. Penny Abernathy is still with us. We've got another big election year ahead. And when we think about, all of the consequences of these news deserts as you've laid out, can you talk a little bit about pink slime sites and your concerns there?
Well, what we've seen based on research done at several universities is that we've seen a rise of what we would call politically backed organizations, PACs, that are funding what we call pink slime sites. They come into an area that has lost a newspaper, establish a digital site that has a name that sounds very impressive, sounds like a traditional newspaper. They don't exist for attracting a number of people to the site. They come up, they rise up during elections, they die down when there's not one. Their whole purpose is to put out something that then gets circulated on social media, and then the algorithm takes over as editor. I would just want to back up to what Daniela was saying about Tallinn. I'm not as familiar with Tallinn as I am with other places in Connecticut. How we judge that is where newspapers are located and what kind of circulation and coverage they have in that area. I don't dispute that the Current and the JI are doing everything they can with reduced staffs to cover Tallinn. What we've lost, so when we've lost 60% of the reporters and you don't have a newspaper there, I hear continually from the regional newspapers that are still in existence, they don't have coverage of local town council meetings, important town council meetings, or routine ones. And the other part we found in the past from research is that the good thing about our ecosystem is that we had people on the ground on those weeklies kind of covering those meetings. And then you had the umbrella coverage, the fantastic umbrella coverage that so many of the prize-winning regional and state papers provided, which was to come in routinely, have people roaming those areas routinely and writing about it. So, we need to think about how it's not so much about newspapers, I want to stress again, but how we rebuild and sustain local journalism so that it fulfills the purpose of what a strong newspaper should have been doing. And some did very well in the past. And that is vitally important, I think, as we look to elections. Strong regional and state newspapers have played an invaluable role in many state elections as well as local elections in vetting the candidates. And I mean, you talk about an overload. It's an overload to try to figure out, in many cases, who's running for office and what their stand is.
Again, you've been hearing Penny Abernathy here on Where We Live, visiting professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Thank you, Penny. We'll be linking to the work that you and your team are doing, tracking these important trends. We appreciate your time today on the show.
Well, thank you very much for discussing this important issue because, as you say, it's very important to our democracy.
Right. And Daniela Altimari, always a pleasure to hear from you, now a reporter for Route 50, a national digital outlet covering state and local government across the U.S. Daniela, thanks.
Thank you.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Katie Pellico. Tess Terrible was on the phones today. Our technical director is Kat Pastor. Please have a great and safe long weekend.